All right, my practice is a little bit different than the speakers that have come before me, and hopefully it will provide a bit of a bridge between some of the topics and the subjects that we've addressed. I'm working in curatorial art practice, and specifically in contemporary art, the conceptual art. So, a redefinition of a few ideas. First of all, we've been talking a lot about food and art, and I think it's important to turn the phrasing of this on its head, and let's talk about taste in art. In contemporary art practice, we talk about the visual arts, we talk about sonic arts, and this has to do with sensory perception. So rather than talking about food and art, let's talk about the sense of taste, and can the sense of taste participate in art practice? Now, when I use the word taste, I think it's also important to create a few to define this term. So, taste is used in philosophical discourse as a sort of aesthetic value. It's also used generally to understand the idea of eating something and all of its complexity, but can be broken down into taste, which happens on the tongue. We have olfaction, which happens retronasally, so as the volatiles move up the back of the throat into the olfactory receptors, and then we have chenesthesis, which is sort of the touch, the temperature, sensations that happen in the mouth, things like minty, cool, and spicy. In terms of art, I'm going to be talking about contemporary art. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but I think it's important to create a definition between using the word art in a very general, vague sort of a way, and the sort of art that we find in contemporary art practice, which is a very specific expression. All right, well, the sense of taste has the distinction of being excluded from art practice. So why is this? I wanted to understand this. I went back to the Greek ideas and understood that in the Greek metaphysics, each person was assigned a star with his immortal soul, and from this star he would come to Earth, and for a brief moment of time he would explore the planet and absorb as much rational data as he could in his adventures. And at some point he would return back to his star where he would explore the findings of his research expedition. Because of this, the Greeks positioned the sense of sight and the sense of sound, the distal senses, as the most important, to place them at the top of a hierarchy of the senses. We'll get into the reasons for that, but largely because of the amount of information that the sense of vision and sounds were able to provide, and the distance between the object of perception and the person who is perceiving them. Along the bottom, depending on who we talk to, we have the sense of touch, smell, and taste, which would be considered as bodily senses and less important. There's really four reasons why the sense of taste was disparaged in Greek thought. The first was that taste offered pleasures which provoked overindulgence. You could make your body ill by eating too much, and an ill body was unable to be as rational as a healthy body. The information provided was subjective, and that was that the things that we ate only told us about ourselves, the person who was doing the perceiving. The immediacy of the object being perceived, that is that the object must be in the mouth in order to perceive it, as opposed to the distal senses of vision and sound, which could perceive from a great distance. And the ephemeral nature of the experience of taste, that is that the object of taste is destroyed in eating. Now, as a chef, we were working with a very creative team, and very often what would happen is that a gallery owner would come to us and say we would like to serve cocktail bites, canapes, for our clientele for the opening of an event. So for instance, we'd have Damien Hirst, who was doing an opening, and they would say to us, make us food that's Damien Hirst-esque. And so we would sit together with our chefs and we would try and brainstorm what did food look like that was inspired by Damien Hirst's art. At some point, because we're clever people, we started to ask the question, when do the things that we're making here become as valid as a medium to communicate the ideas of Damien Hirst as his artwork did? And so when I came across these four reasons why the sense of taste was disparaged, it wasn't satisfying for me. I recognized that there had been quite a lot of change since the time of Greek thought until the present, and I thought that that wasn't being reflected in this exclusion of the sense of taste and art. First of all, the metaphysics had changed. So most of us don't believe that our eternal soul lives on a star and that we have field trips to Earth to do field research. In the same way, through the Christian era, the sense of taste was moralized. There was a sort of moral thumbprint that was attached to the idea of eating. If we considered the 7 deadly sin, one of them the sin of gluttony, our eternal soul could be damned for 5 reasons. First of all, for snacking. Second, the pursuit of delicacies. Third, saucing and seasoning. Fourth, eating in abundance. And fifth, eating with too much enthusiasm. Now, what was considered a moral sin at that time now seems to be the norm. It seems to actually be the features of our food industry. This is a snack aisle in a grocery store in many places in the world. And yet this moral thumbprint remains in our psyche. So don't snack between meals is something that I grew up hearing. The way that we eat when we present ourselves in front of the plate defines our culture. So how cultured or how boorish are we? So these effects linger till today. Another change that, oh my goodness, what have I done? Is there any way of restoring that? Close that one. There we go. Okay. Science had changed. So the science of the time was Aristotle's software, if you want to say, of perception, his ideas of how the body perceived. And that was tacked on to Galen's physiology. And there's a concept of a three-ventricle brain. And this idea, which is you can see in Leonardo da Vinci's painting, existed all the way to the end of the Renaissance. And when I considered these questions, I said, well, this is obviously very different from the science that we have today. I think that we should include the new understanding of the senses into this. And so here we have a map of the brain as we understand it now. And we know that, for instance, the sense of taste is hardwired through memory and emotion to our brain. Gastronomy has changed. So from its early caveman days until now, we've seen quite a lot of transformation. If you consider the Greek position would have been roughly around the roasted meats and vegetables, the main concern had to do, there was a certain aesthetic involved, of course, but it had to do with nutritional eating as well. Since that time, we've seen transformations on the plate, new design concepts and ideas. We've had an infusion of science, which has really unlocked the potential of food to express ideas. It's also changed its function from something of sating the appetite, nourishing the body, to an exploration of the mind. We now eat not only to sate ourselves, but to explore, to amuse ourselves. Another transformation, which may be controversial in this space, is the idea of flavor. Art was made possible for visual art when pigment was taken from nature, the colors that we found around us. It was transformed into paint, and through the brush and the canvas started to represent ideas that we had developed through living in the world. In the same way, the sounds that we found in nature were embodied in instruments. The musical notation was provided in order to play this music, and music became a sort of artistic expression as well. Up until about 70 years, our participation with flavor has been in direct contact with nature. Of course, through gastronomy, there's sort of transformative action that happens, but in general, we're speaking about eating something directly from nature. About 70 years ago, the flavor industry started to develop and extract flavors from nature. Not only were they extracting and distilling flavors from nature, but they were also producing their own flavors. And with the same sort of science as the notation in music, we're now able to compose ideas and flavors that don't exist except in our fantasies and our imaginations. What's important about this as well is that the object of perception, the flavor that's being presented to us, is universal. It doesn't change from one person to the next. And I think this is an important feature in art, is that everybody is talking about the same thing. All right, art has changed. For the longest time, we considered aesthetics as the standard in art. And aesthetics is about the embodiment of beauty. And I think that this is still a consideration here today, is that art is transformed from an aesthetic expression to a conceptual one. And Hegel came along and he presented us with the idea of the absolute spirit, which is about human participation in the divine. And what happened from this point is that art ceased to be about the evaluation of the aesthetic content of an object of art, and started to be about the embodiment of this absolute spirit. The embodiment and expression of the concept. Now, aesthetics has a role to play in this, of course, but it has more to do with the packaging for the concept than the idea of delivering the concept itself. And this is quite an important feature of the work that I did. So when I looked around at what sort of food was being used in the artwork, in contemporary art practice, I found that food was being used in three ways. First of all, as performance. So here we have Karen Finley, who scandalized the stage and was pushing buttons of taboo through her performances, and she very often used food as a prop in performance. And here she has smeared herself with chocolate, and this piece is called Groceries. We have Janine Antoni, who shows us an example of food as sculpture. In this piece, she's used a classical representation of a bust, and she's carved her likeness out of chocolate and out of soap. And in her artwork, she then proceeded to lick the features of the chocolate bust of herself off until it was returned to a chocolate mass. And she bathed herself, well, with herself, until the features dissolved in the bathtub with the soap. So food is sculpture. The third way that we find food being used in contemporary art practice is as a social medium. This is an art piece by a dear artist, a friend of mine, Alfonso Barragán from Spain, and he came to India and we were doing projects together there, and he wanted to explore how new experiences were absorbed into traditional societies. How those experiences were absorbed, but also how they were transmitted between people, and then later how they were remembered. So what he did is he took something very familiar to people, the street food, and he asked them to insert an organic phosphorescent material that allowed the food to glow in the dark. And so the street vendor started to cook this food. There was black light that was suspended over top of the space. He played some music to create a sort of festive experience. And it was amazing to watch how people in this small enclave started to come out. People were texting photographs to each other, and it wasn't long before there was a whole throng of people, and actually in the streets, the balconies are arranged vertically, and so there was almost like a sort of theater happening where there was people standing on their balconies looking down and watching this food experience. Now the thing that all three of these have in common is that flavor of the food is really irrelevant to the artwork and to the concept of the artwork. And for me, this is an important thing because I would argue that it's not really an art of food unless the thing that makes it food, the flavor, that direct contact with our sense of taste is embodied in the art concept. So when I looked to find where was the sense of taste engaged in contemporary art, I was a little disappointed. There's really two categories that I found. The first is what I like to call wall licking, where basically people are having sort of taste experiences by licking things. This is a Jaffa cake promotional campaign, and so it wasn't intended as art, but I think there's certainly intended artistic dimension to it. The second was guided taste adventures. So here we have Marina Abramovic, who worked with a chef, or had a chef rather, prepare a dish called Volcano Flambé. And after you've paid your money and you sit down at the table and they deliver you a flambé with your eyes closed, you open up this wooden box and Marina Abramovic's voice guides you through a taste experience. For me, these two examples of tasted art, if we could call it so, were unsatisfactory. I think that it doesn't embody the full potential of the sense of taste and the things that the sense of taste can mean for us. So a lot of the work that I'm doing is looking at how we can sort of bridge the gap between this sort of art into something that would be better. There's a few obstacles in our way. First of all, there's three distinctive pedagogies. We have the chef, who is trained technically to demonstrate his ideas in a format of deliciousness, where deliciousness is a sort of standard, the hallmark or ideal of his culinary creations. We have the scientist, who's looking to understand how the world works, and then to take this understanding and apply it in the form of technology. And then we have the artist, whose job is to explore the human condition, to provoke, to ask questions, to critique, to subvert. And he does this through a form of narrative. He creates a discussion between himself in his artwork, which is embodied in symbols and concepts, and the audience. And the audience is expected to have a certain amount of knowledge in order to understand what these concepts represent. And it's this game, this puzzle game between the artist and his audience, where the art comes alive. And the degree to which it's successful is the degree to which his concept is communicated. In contemporary art, there's a sort of ideal that could be related to mathematical equations, where although it may be possible to describe something in a very long format, the ideal, of course, is to shorten it to its most simplistic form. Something like E equals mc squared for a mathematician is beautiful for the scope that it's able to communicate, the ideas that it expresses, but also for its simplicity. And I would say that this is a value of contemporary art as well. Flavor is a problem because we're not very good at it. We don't know at tasting, that is. We don't know with our tongue what we know with our mind. If you place a pencil and a pen side by side on a table, people would be able to tell you this is a pencil, this is a pen, it's a ballpoint pen, not a fountain pen, it's blue, not red, this is the brand. When we try and do the same thing with flavor, we run into all sorts of problems. If we remove ourselves from all of the visual stimulus and from the context of the flavor, it becomes very difficult for us to discern the difference between, for instance, the flavor of pineapple and the flavor of orange. So this is an obstacle for using flavor in artwork. What it means is that we need to create a sort of context in which we place these flavors that we taste. And for me, this is no trouble. I don't see it as an obstacle for a tasted sort of art. For me, the important part is that the center, the punchline of the concept is delivered through the flavor. In addition to this can be all sorts of contexts, and you see this all the time in contemporary art, where it's not only about the things that you see, but it's also the things that you read, the things that you hear. Traditional transmission of symbols. So visual arts have been working in a language of symbols for a very long time. We've developed a language that's easily recognized. My 10-year-old child, if asked which one of these was the peace signal, would be able to tell you this is the peace sign right here. And inside of this developed language, we're able to say a lot, and this is to the benefit of art. Art actually passed through symbolist movement where these ideas were developed. But we've never passed through such a symbolist movement with flavor. The associations between flavors and the things, the ideas that they represent aren't taught for the most part, and rarely are they recognized generally. It's not to say that there aren't any. There are. For instance, if we talked about where I live at the moment in India, a way for me to participate directly in Indianness and the identity of India is through its food, through its flavors. The idea of a lemon, it projects the idea of sanitation, of sunshine, perhaps. And using this sort of discourse, we could talk about the flavors of war, we could talk about the flavors of poverty, of opulence and wealth. But we have to ask the question, do we need to? It is possible to train people to say that one flavor can equal another idea. But first of all, we have to ask, is it necessary? And are people going to invest in this idea if they have other ways to receive this information? Intentionality. This is quite an important one, because I think that with a simple act of intentionality, we can transform a lot of molecular gastronomy, conceptual thinking into artwork. What is the difference between these two pieces of creative expression? Here we have Marcel Duchamp's fountain, famously placed, borrowed from everyday life and placed inside a museum, and instructed that we're meant to appreciate this as art, and it was scandalous at the time. And here on the other side we have Azurmendi's idea of embodiment of the Basque seaside. He's created his experience, maybe his childhood experience, and his familiarity with something that's very dear to him through a dish where you can see we have the ocean represented in the glass of the plate. We even have the fog of morning maybe coming off of the water through the steam. But embodied in this dish is the flavor of his experience with the Basque seaside, and he wants to share that with us. But there's a problem that it hasn't been intended as artwork. And in order to participate in artwork, it's very important to state an intention to participate in the discourse of art. Art is an ongoing discourse, and it's about things that we have to say to each other. And if we create an object that can be considered as artwork, but we don't intend it to be, then it sort of mumbles at the fringe of this artistic discourse. I simply state that placing this plate in an artistic capacity and saying, appreciate this as art. This is something controversial perhaps. Can art be tasted? What can be communicated through ideas? And suddenly this piece becomes an act of artwork. Just as every urinal is not a piece of art, as Duchamp's fountain, so every piece of gastronomy should not be considered as artwork unless it is intended to be. So a few examples from my own work. This is an artist called Oskar Dawicki. He's a Polish performance artist. And we did this piece together for the European Union Congress of Culture in Wrocław in Poland. Oscar's a funny artist. He uses a lot of irony, but he also holds a certain contempt for the established art world. And he wanted to express his contempt on this moment on this stage. And he wanted to do that through the idea of distaste. And so I worked with him to develop a series of, a buffet of canapes, small cocktail bites, where aesthetically they were attractive, but each of them possessed a distaste. Distaste, as Paul Rosen might tell you, is a boundary between the human animal and the cultured human man. It's an educated moral emotion. It's something that we learn. And what is distasteful and disgusting for us in one society and one culture may not be disgusting in somebody else's culture. And so we embodied distaste in each of these canapes, and what was interesting is that as people tasted, so for instance we have a burnt croûte with a strong blue cheese, we have a green walnut, and a crab apple with a very strong sour and astringent properties. And so people would take these bites, they would put them into their mouth, they would be disgusted by them, and then they would try and rinse their palates by moving on to the next one, the next food, which was equally as distasteful, but in a completely different way. And then at the end we toasted it with meat vodka, so I just made a meat-infused vodka. This worked very well for Oskar. He was able to demonstrate his contempt. And at the same time, we explored the idea of disgust. So this thing that was meant to, that it normally repels us, that pushes us away, became a point of celebration for the people there. And they would eat these bites and they go, oh, it was disgusting, and it's fantastic, you have to try it. And so it's a celebration of disgust. Another artist, Alfonso Barragan, the same one who did the glow-in-the-dark food, he did this project in London called Ether, and it was about communicating trapped experiences. And so the main object in his artwork were these glass bulbs here, where there was a series of volatile molecules in each of them. And so people were encouraged not just to sniff them, but to really stick their face over top of the bottle and inhale and to taste as well as to smell these experiences. And it could be anything from toothpaste, which would remind us of our daily ritual of hygiene, to something like truffles that might present an idea of exoticness or of wealth. And so people would go around, and it was really fun to see them trying to identify which ones were which, and sometimes they would provoke memories from their childhood or from experiences that they had had. He also had this helium balloon and helium on tap, and so people could come up and take a hit of helium, and they would suddenly, their voice would change, and there would be this new experience as they walked around the art gallery, talking in a high-pitched voice about the artwork that we had presented. And he did a very interesting thing. He likes to play with the ephemeral nature of art, things that were transient. And so he took the air inside of the gallery as the flavors were being released, as people breathed these experiences, and he sucked it up and he compressed it inside of this metal bottle. And the idea is quite beautiful because it closes a conceptual circle where if you wanted to experience the documentation for this event, you could open the bottle and somehow participate in all of this breathing and these flavors, but at the same time it would disappear and nobody else would have that experience as you did. So, gastronomy and art, two very different traditions. Gastronomy has been, maybe because of its exclusion from art world, has developed independently. Somewhere between art and tradecraft. It has its own norms, its own practices, its own values and traditions, as does art itself. And I think there's an opportunity to learn from these two traditions. To say, not can art be tasted, but what does food have to say? What is a story that only flavor can express in artwork? I get a few lessons from this, and these are projects that I'm working on. But first of all, it's about the way that art industry develops its ideas, its research and its development. Up until now, for the most part, new ideas in food are created inside of restaurants. I would argue that it's not an ideal space. Restaurants are restricted by factors such as cost, consistency, time. It's a production, and it's a mass production in most cases. Now the kitchen is changing, and so I recognize that very often now in the new kitchens that there's actually developmental kitchens that happen on the side, and I think this is fantastic. But I'm talking about the bog standard kitchen where we wake up in the morning and we start to chop our vegetables and we create a production line of food that flows into the restaurants. Is not the ideal space for a young creative person to try and innovate new frontiers in flavor and food. What would happen if we took, for instance, the artist residency, where artists come into a space that's designed specifically to provoke ideas, where they're given materials and budgets in order to explore these ideas? And what would happen if we did that in gastronomy with food? And what would happen then if we took those findings and we presented them in galleries and in museums? And museums are very keen to have these kind of experiences to bring the old idea of museum to life through interaction and through stimulation of all of the senses. Another area which I think needs improvement is critical studies of gastronomy and the domain of the art critic. Now there are some good art critics and there are some very bad ones. And most of them have the power in their pen to elevate or to destroy a chef or a restaurant or to elevate them to stardom. But it's based on principles of hedonic response. So I eat something, I like it or I don't like it. How aesthetic is it? And I think that we need to move beyond this sort of hedonic aesthetic evaluation of cuisine and start to consider other factors as we do in critical theory in art or music or literature. And so this kind of analysis opens the door to take structures from inside of the art world and apply them to gastronomy in new ways. And I think that this could be the beginning of a new academia of food criticism and evaluation, critical thought. And such a platform would allow us to consider transformations in the food industry. So what is coming down the line in food? We have 3D printing. How far are we from food replicators? Molecular gastronomy, where is it going? How far are we detaching ourselves from the food that we find in nature? What is commonly understood as the new fundamentals, things like resource scarcity, urbanization, contests of power inside of the food industry, and then new advances in science and technology. So here we have Cass and Jure's, what did they call it, victimless cuisine, where they took a stem cell from a living frog, and they cultured the stem cell and they grew it in a petri dish, and the frog continued to live. And further down the line, as the meat has, the muscle tissue had developed, they served it as a sort of feast, I guess is how they would call it, with a living frog at the end of the table. So how do we understand these changes and these transformations in art, in society, in science and technology, and food? At the end, I think the thing that's most dear to my heart is the idea of embodiment. We don't work, our minds don't work in a hierarchy of the senses. There's crosstalk between all of our senses happening all the time. From the moment that we enter the room where we're going to eat, while we're eating, and the way that we remember those foods, it's a synesthesia of all of our senses, and that needs to be represented in art. If art is about a conversation that we're having about the human experience, about the absolute ideals of life, and questioning our existence and our purposes and our ways of life, then we need to be able to have that conversation through all of the sensory modes. And we need to hear what the non-visual senses, the chemical senses, have to tell us about what it is to be human. And that is the end of my talk.